Hey Adventures, today is going to be a review for The Fellowship of the Ring by J.R.R. Tolkien. This is the first part of the Lord of the Rings, and often people consider it to be the first book in the trilogy, that's debatable, and I tend to say that no, it's not part of it. It's not a trilogy, it's a single book split into 3 parts. So this is an epic fantasy, it's a high fantasy, it's also a quest fantasy. It's kind of the beginning of so many of the tropes and subgenres that we know today and are popular today. Although less so today than 10-20 years ago even. Before we get much further into this review though, I'd just really quickly like to say if you like what you're seeing from an Erudite adventure, we'd really appreciate it if you would like, comment, and subscribe to us if you haven't already. So, The Fellowship of the Ring is the first part of The Lord of the Rings by John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. This is of course my favorite author, book, and series, and the book that I have long considered to be as close to perfect as is humanly possible. But even with all that praise, I want to attempt to give this book an actual good review rather than just gush about it the entire time. I know that I said something very similar in my review of The Hobbit just recently, and that's because I love the book so much and I could gush about them and talk about them for hours. But for the sake of this video, I want it to be an actual review of the book itself. So with The Fellowship being part 1, I can't really talk about the entire story, so I will kind of end it where the book itself ends, and actually I won't really even go to that point. I will reference it in a few brief comments, but really won't be talking too much about it at all. So the premise of this book, as most people probably know because it's so ingrained in our pop culture at the moment, the premise of this book is that a magic ring that has been in the possession of a hobbit named Bilbo for the past 60 years and then given to his nephew and heir, Frodo, who has now had it for about 17 years, this ring is discovered to be more than just a magic ring. It is the One Ring, created and forged by the Dark Lord Sauron and imbued with all his will and malice. So the hobbits set out for Rivendell in hopes of gaining counsel on what to do with this ring. They know it cannot be kept, but they must decide in what way they are going to get rid of it. Along their way, they come across many trials and adventures, and the way gets constantly more and more dangerous. So that is, doesn't even take us halfway through the book, but that's just a very brief overview of how the premise of this book, how it starts, what the primary conflict of this book is going to be. We are introduced to a host of characters in this book and end up following 9 of them specifically beyond the brief chapter or chapters that they are in. So, I mean, along the way, in the chapters themselves, we'll have characters like Fredegar Bolger, or Tom Bombadil, or Barlaam Butterbur, or so many of these other characters that you meet along the way and that are important to the story at the time that they're there, but they don't continue on past their few chapters that they're in. However, there are 9 characters that do continue on past that we meet and that become what is known as the 9 Walkers, or the Fellowship of the Ring, which is obviously the title of the first book. Personally, I really like the pacing and characterizations and tropes and writing and really just about everything about this book. But some people have some criticisms when it comes to each of these things, and because I want this to be an actual good review of the book, I will mention what some of those criticisms and give some commentary of my own on them. People will say that the pacing can be slow. We spend around 100 pages in the Shire or trying to get out of the Shire before really even barely starting the journey. There are also chapters that some people feel are completely unnecessary, and I'm going to leave that there and come back to it at the end of this video as one of my final discussion points for this review. Most of the time when somebody complains about the characters, it is either to say that they fall into archetypes, or that they are extremely black and white, having no complexity to their morality. Neither of these are completely accurate. These characters that Tolkien wrote and created are in many ways the beginnings of the archetypes they represent, or maybe the solidification and realization of these archetypes that have been around for a long time in storytelling, forever in storytelling, and are just, Tolkien is kind of the one who made them famous in many ways. Not always, he didn't make every single character archetype famous, but he made a lot of them, like the Wise Old Mentor, wizard type character. That's one that he popularized. The farm boy, forced to leave his peaceful home and go on an adventure, is another one that he popularized. There's just a lot of things like that. Even the Dark Lord, to some extent, is one that he popularized. Tolkien isn't considered the father of modern fantasy for no reason. But in terms of the cut and dry morality, this argument that people have where, oh, they're so one-sided, they always make the right decision, they're never bad, they never make wrong decisions, any of that kind of stuff. This series is very different than so many of our modern books where every character has to be morally gray. They have to struggle and make bad decisions and make good decisions and make some decisions that are going to hurt them and not really know what they think and all these kinds of things. That's how our modern books are written and oftentimes what our modern audiences want to read. But that's not how this book was written. That's not the reason for this book. This is a simpler book where it's obvious that the Dark Lord is the bad guy and every decision made by the good guys must be done to counter Sauron. As such, it seems at times that they never made a bad decision or struggle with their morality, but that is really not the case. There is specifically one character in Fellowship of the Ring that I'm thinking of that we see this struggle very, very strongly with. But as we continue through the series, we find, beyond just the Fellowship of the Ring, we find that it actually affects every single one of our characters that is a main character in the series. And every single character that plays a major role, is how I wrote it. But I don't know that I completely agree with that, because there's a lot of characters that play a major role, but that aren't main characters, and so they aren't really explored in the same. And then finally on the idea of people not liking the writing for whatever reason, or specifically Tolkien's writing style, almost everyone agrees that the writing is technically, in a technical sense, amazingly well written. The books are amazingly well written. But for those who have an issue with the book's writing, it comes down to the descriptiveness or even the archaicness of the writing at times. Tolkien likes to describe where you are at, but what he does in a way that I've never really seen any other authors do, I'm sure there are some other ones, he tailors each specific, or he tailors the tone and the descriptions to the specific location and the characters are in and the dangers they are facing, so that when you go into a certain place, you go into a underground kingdom, you feel like you are underground in this kingdom. You're feeling the darkness, but also the vastness of these underground halls. Or you go out into the forest, into the woodland forest that with the sun shining down, and it's peaceful and beautiful, and you can feel that peace, you can feel that beauty, you can feel the sun shining down and the magic of that realm. You can, as you're reading the books, you get an understanding of these locations so deeply because of how he writes the books. Some people are annoyed with the level of description that he uses, but it's done in a way that is so particular that it enhances the story. As for the archaicness, people say that he is hard to read. That's a comment that I've heard time and time again regarding Tolkien, is that he's not an easy, the Lord of the Rings is hard to read. He actually isn't really that hard to read. What he doesn't do is use extremely accessible prose, like in the way that Brandon Sanderson does. Brandon Sanderson writes so that you can just read the book, get the story, and move on. You don't have to think about what's being said. You don't have to ponder or question or try and understand what is being said. And there's really not a whole lot of that in Tolkien either. He lays it out for you, but he does it very descriptively. But he also uses a higher quality of language than many authors nowadays. And as such, it can seem archaic, or like an older form of the English language that we really aren't used to. Having read the Bible all my life, the writing style really isn't difficult, and it's really not archaic and not older in that way, because I'm so used to that writing style. And the Lord of the Rings, written 300 years after the Bible, was translated into English. So it doesn't really bother me or affect me in any way. However, Tolkien was a philologist and a professor of the English language. He had an extremely intimate knowledge of the language, and it really does show in his writing. The last thing I want to talk about with this review is people's misunderstanding of what this story is. People assume and like to think and talk about The Lord of the Rings as if it is the story of the quest to destroy the One Ring. But rather, this book is not the quest to destroy the One Ring, or the story of the quest to destroy the One Ring. It is a memoir of the journey of 4 hobbits and their adventures during the events of the War of the Ring. That's a kind of a expansive title, but that's essentially what this book is. You're telling the story of these 4 hobbits that leave the Shire and go on adventures that happen to coincide with the events of the War of the Ring. When you view the story in that light, you understand why there are moments that seem unnecessary to the story of the Ring. That's because they are unnecessary to the story of the Ring. However, they are of utmost importance to the story of the hobbits, and that's when approaching this story, you have to realize this is the story of 4 hobbits. This isn't the story of the Ring. So, because of that, if you can go into the book expecting it to be the story of 4 hobbits, then you'll be blown away by how epic and grand a story of 4 hobbits can be. And that's one of the brilliant things about Tolkien's approach to writing this story, to telling this story. Also, I did listen to this upon this reread. This is a book that I reread every year. I usually end the year in December with The Hobbit and start the year with The Lord of the Rings in January. So I did listen to this one on audiobook, the audiobook specifically narrated by Andy Serkis, and to no one's surprise, he is excellent as the narrator and does a fantastic job. So much so that I would just forget that Serkis was narrating and would just be so engrossed that, like, if a character was talking, it was just the character. It wasn't Andy Serkis himself. When he'd switch back to the narration portion, then you'd be like, oh yeah, Andy Serkis is narrating this book. But then he'd go into the characters and do the characters' voices, and you're just like, oh, this is this character, this is Gandalf, this is Frodo, this is Aragorn, and you'd know instantly who it was because he was so good at the voices, and they did not sound like Andy Serkis. So that's just a testament to the quality of Serkis's narration. Part of it, of course, he knows this world so well. He knows he played Gollum in the movies, and he clearly has a great love and understanding of what this series is. And so he's able to approach the books in a way that when listening to them with his narration, you can tell that he just knows what he's doing, and it's incredible to listen to. So that is my review for The Fellowship of the Ring. Thank you guys so much for watching an Erudite Adventure. We post videos every Monday and Thursday. We have our social medias linked in the description down below. We'll see you guys again soon. Stay well.